Today, of course, I'm going to be getting into talking about the Reconstruction era, which takes place, of course, after the American Civil War from 1865 to 1877. Of course, I will talk about maybe 10 minutes or so about the Abraham Lincoln assassination, which really altered a lot of things, about how the Reconstruction would happen with the southern states after the Civil War ended. So yeah, there should be a PowerPoint lecture. Actually, I combined them into one lecture, which you can see that's part of it right there. I think there are two parts, but I kind of combined them in Canvas for you. It's one lecture. It is a lot of material because this will take, of course, today's lecture and probably part of another lecture next week. Because, Monday and Tuesday, we do not have classes. Of course, Mardi Gras coming up. So I probably won't finish Reconstruction until probably next Thursday when I'll get also into the Gilded Age. So we'll probably have a Canvas quiz about this period we're doing now, but not till next week overall. So yeah, let's of course get into and talk about, of course, what happened. As you know, the Civil War, it pretty much was coming to an end. I think April 9th, 1865, that's when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. So the war was kind of coming to an end at that point. And there's, of course, different theories on, what exactly they were going to do at the end of the Civil War. There's all kinds of theories, more or less, that were circulating, which went back to, by the way, 1863. I think Lincoln had some ideas. Other Republicans, like the radical Republicans, had some ideas about how they wanted to reconstruct the country after the war. So I'll kind of go into and I'll talk about, what were some of those theories that they had that were well known. You can see back in 1863, they already had that Lincoln had a plan about how he was going to reconstruct the South, more or less. It was often called the 10% plan, either way you want to spell it, 10%. And I think it had two parts to his plan. One part, of course, was that what they were going to do was that they were going to allow states to return as long as 10% of the voters took an allegiance. Like 10% of the voters in 1860 in each state took an allegiance to the Union. So that's all they had to do to get in. And then also he offered what they call amnesty as well, like amnesty to various Confederates that fought in the war, except the only ones that he wouldn't give a pardon to would be basically those like Confederates in the government, like Jefferson Davis, etc., Robert E. Lee, different like generals, or also Confederates who had mistreated Union POWs. So those are like the main groups that wouldn't get amnesty, and the other ones would. And all they would have to do, also states, would be to abolish slavery as well, like agree to that federal policy overall. So that's basically the differences between the two sides with what they have to do. They also had what they call the Wade-Davis bill, which came out in 1864. That particular idea. This one was another one, which two men were behind that idea, which were Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio and Representative Harry Winter Davis of Maryland. They came up with that idea, the Wade-Davis bill. This bill was kind of created because they were kind of concerned that when the southern states came back in, that the Democrats would basically try to control the South and prevent African Americans from having any rights overall. So the whole plan was to restrict basically Southerners that had fought for the Confederacy, like restrict their rights. They had this part of the plan, you may have heard of it, was called the Ironclad Oath, where Southerners had to take an oath that they never support the Confederacy. And so that would exclude a lot of Southerners from basically being able to vote. However, if you know about it, It was pocket vetoed by Lincoln. A pocket veto is where when Congress is not in session, and if they create a bill within 10 days, if the president doesn't sign it, it expires. It doesn't become a law, pretty much. And so it didn't. So that was one thing that happened. They were trying to do that idea. Also, let me try to talk about this as well. There were different theories, like Lincoln and Johnson, Andrew Johnson, who of course was president later. They had all different theories about the whole Civil War. Lincoln and Johnson thought that the Civil War had been a rebellion of individuals, and that a state can't really leave the Union. So they didn't really believe that secession was possible. And on top of that, the Confederacy was never recognized by any foreign country. On top of that, in fact, they would repudiate their debts and all that. Then you have the radical Republicans that you had. So the radical Republicans, they were also there. Radical Republicans were Republicans that were in Congress that were kind of radical. They were against Lincoln's ideas. And they had different theories about also Reconstruction, which I could put on the screen for you. But they had two ideas. Thaddeus Stevens, who was a representative of Pennsylvania, and he had also Charles Sumner, a senator of Massachusetts. They had their own ideas. They believed that Reconstruction should be controlled by the Congress and not the president, which is what Lincoln and Johnson wanted originally. Charles Sumner believed that an idea called state suicide or state suicide argument, that states basically, when they seceded from the Union, were committing suicide when they left. And so what that meant is that they were now an unorganized territory. And so that meant that only Congress can control that, because that's what the Constitution says. And you can also look at you ever heard of the Northwest Ordinance? I think in 1787, that pretty much, the Congress is pretty much controlling how a territory becomes a state overall. Thaddeus Stevens, though, believed that in the conquered province theory, that they had been conquered because of war, like by the Northern Army, Union Army had come down, conquered them. And so he believed that it should be like military reconstruction, military rule, by military governors controlling. And that's pretty much what happens, later in the end. So that's pretty much the argument, that they have, Stevens and Sumner, and why they think that the Southerners shouldn't be reconciled, at least at this point anyway, in history. But of course, then you got the Lincoln assassination that, of course, occurs, which really alters, like I said, Reconstruction. It totally changed, what would happen with the policies of Reconstruction in the next few years. And if you know about Abraham Lincoln, he was the first president to be assassinated. As you know, there's been 4 presidents that have been shot and killed, which if you want the other 3 for later, you probably know them. Hopefully some of them you probably know. But James Garfield was later assassinated, William McKinley, and of course, probably one of the most famous assassinations that happened was John F. Kennedy. I think the Lincoln and Kennedy assassinations are really considered to be the 2 most famous assassinations that occurred in American history, more or less. And Abraham Lincoln was shot by, of course, a man you may have heard of named John Wilkes Booth. I'll get to this picture later. There's John Wilkes Booth. And John Wilkes Booth was an American actor who was from, by the way, he was from Virginia, is where he was. And of course, he would shoot Abraham Lincoln on the date of April 14th, 1865, at Ford's Theater, which is now a museum in Washington. And he actually was a popular actor. In fact, his whole family, Booth family, was a very popular family of actors. I think his brother and his father had been actors He had pretty much acted in a lot of plays. I think he was famous for acting as Brutus, I thought, which is kind of ironic in one of the Shakespearean plays I think he did before. Now, I think he may have been a spy, they think, for the Confederacy, but never fought for the Confederacy, like in war, more or less. If you know about Booth, he was involved, they believe, in a conspiracy. It wasn't just like one person involved, like maybe like Lee Harvey Oswald or something like that. Some people think was a lone gunman or whatever, but they think that he was part of a conspiracy often called the Lincoln Conspiracy, which involved many people. And they believed it was part of a plan to kidnap Lincoln to maybe alter the end of the Civil War. Maybe if they kidnapped him and brought him to the South, the North would have to sue for peace or whatever because we kidnapped their president. So maybe that was the idea of what Booth, wanted to do overall. But I think what happened was the war ended because April 9th, remember, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant's forces. And so he realized that they'd have to kill him instead, is what it was. Who are the other conspirators? I do have a picture showing the other conspirators that were involved in the assassination, which are right there in the picture. I've got them. I'll put them on the screen for you so you know who they were. The main conspirators that were also involved were Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and David Harold. Kind of a little bit about all of those four right there. Of course, they were later executed. The only four that were executed, by the way, of course, for the Lincoln Conspiracy in July of 1865. Of course, Mary Surratt, who you see on the left right there, she owned a boarding house in Washington, D.C., and that's basically where they met. All the conspirators decide what they were going to do in the conspiracy. And then next to her is Lewis Powell, who had an alias, Payne, like Lewis Payne, they called him as well. And Lewis Powell, or Payne, as we know about it, he was slated as an assassin that was supposed to go and kill William Seward. He was the Secretary of State. They were trying to kill like the top people in the government. The guy on the right here is David Harold. Harold was he aided Lewis Powell in finding William Seward's house, basically. And anyway, when Powell went there, I think he had two pistols, maybe a dagger or something like that. And the pistols misfired. I think he only wounded William Seward and didn't kill him. David Harold also helped John Wilkes Booth as well a little later with the conspiracy. And the guy on the right, George Atzerodt, he was actually supposed to kill Andrew Johnson, who was the vice president. And I don't know if you know it, back in those days, they didn't have a vice presidential White House. In fact, the vice president would stay in like a hotel or something, which is where Johnson was. And so he went to his hotel and tried to kill him. And I think he sat in the saloon, like drinking and just chickened out. He didn't want to do it. And so he didn't kill Johnson. So Johnson got lucky and wasn't killed, basically. But of course, as you know, John Wilkes Booth, of course, was more successful, and of course would end up, of course, killing Lincoln in the assassination. Now, Lincoln was shot, by the way, from his he had a presidential balcony, by the way, where he sat there that night. Of course, April 14th, 1865. He went to see, of course, a famous play at the time that was called Our American Cousin. It was a comedy. And with him were three other people. His wife, of course, Mrs. Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln was there. Also, there were two other people, although if you know about the story about this, Ulysses S. Grant was supposed to be there with his wife, but he canceled. He didn't want to, for some reason he couldn't come. And so they had Major Henry Rathbone, who was a Union soldier. He was there. And he had Clara Harris with him, who was, I think, his fiance. So those are the four that were actually in the presidential box when, of course, Booth, of course, shot him. Booth arrived there. Of course, they let him go pretty much into the theater because everybody knew who he was. He was, a famous actor at the time. There was a guard, by the way, that was guarding Lincoln's door, but he evidently went to get a drink, like a liquor or whatever. He was like a Pinkerton guard. At the time, they did not have the Secret Service yet. It would not be created until July of 1865 because of this assassination. And so Booth was able to get into the presidential box. He basically blocked the doorway, or really locked it, and then crept up behind Lincoln and then shot him in the back of the head with a .30 caliber Derringer, is what they believe it was. Anyway, when he shot Lincoln, Rathbone tried to stop him, and so basically Booth took out his dagger and stabbed Rathbone. But in the process, when he tried to jump over the balcony, he caught his right leg on the flag. I think that was draping the balcony, and basically broke his left leg. I want to say his shin bone broke, and so with that, if you know about what happened after he shot Lincoln, he supposedly said the famous statement, like they said in the video, which was "Sic semper tyrannis," which they didn't talk about that, but it's the motto of Virginia, the state of Virginia. Thus always to tyrants is what it means. They also think that when he left, he may have also said, "The South is avenged," as he left the actual theater. There's another story which is very true as well. There was a man named Edmund Spangler who was a stagehand and carpenter at the theater. He actually held Booth's horse, like tending it, and held it for him as he was outside with his horse, I guess. And so they think he may have been somehow a conspirator involved in it. He's like the getaway guy, kind of like that. And so he got in trouble for it in prison, basically for maybe possibly being in the conspiracy, but he was later pardoned. They're not sure if he really knew what Booth was going to do when he went into the actual theater. So they're not sure about that. What we do know is that Lincoln, though, was brought across the street after he was shot, and he died the next day. But his actual assassination date is April 15th, 1865. They think dying about maybe 7:22 a.m. Pretty much went in and out of consciousness the whole time. And so because he died, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, became the 17th president of the United States, who was a Democrat, by the way, which is interesting about that later. And John Wilkes Booth then was able to escape into Virginia. He got help from David Harold, who I told you about. They both escaped on horseback. And he was eventually brought to this man named Dr. Samuel Mudd, who I'll mention about as well, who has also been implicated in the conspiracy as well. He was a doctor in Virginia. And I think they say David Harold knew who he was and brought Booth there, where he helped basically fix Booth's broken leg. And I think in the process, they had to cut off Booth's boot on his left leg. They found it later in the house. I think when the Union forces came later, they found it. And Mudd was later found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. But a lot of people think that Mudd didn't really know what happened. I think he kind of knew about the assassination at that point, had heard about it, but he didn't really. I don't think that he knew actual Booth. I think he knew David Harold, but didn't know Booth. But he was accused of basically somehow being involved in the conspiracy. And later he went to prison, I think in Florida somewhere, but because he was a doctor and he helped out people with, like, say, malaria at the time, which was real bad, malaria or yellow fever, he was given later a presidential pardon in 1869 by Andrew Johnson. Samuel Mudd is famous for a famous statement he said, which is, "My name is Mudd." So yeah, that's interesting about that, about him. Maybe I don't think he was really involved either in the conspiracy. Um, Also, these other people. Spangler went to prison. He was pardoned. Samuel Mudd too. Also, like I said, was in prison, but he was pardoned. John Surratt, by the way, was the son of Mary Surratt. He was involved too in the conspiracy as well. He actually fled the country. He went to Canada and then Europe, and I think somehow the United States extradited him from Egypt, which is crazy. But they brought him back, but he was never convicted of anything, and so he kind of got off also as well. What happened to John Wilkes Booth? Well, eventually he was captured. Well, they tried to capture him, actually, in Virginia. What happened was Booth and David Harold were found out that they were in Bowling Green, Virginia. They were on a tobacco farm owned by the Garrett family. And anyway, when the soldiers surrounded the barn, they wouldn't come out. And so they set it on fire. And David Harold, he surrendered without a shot and all that. But Booth wouldn't surrender. And so a soldier, they supposedly crept around the side of the barn, and he saw Booth, and he shot him, or he shot at him. This was April 26, 1865. And I've got a picture of the man that shot him. It was this, of course, guy named Boston Corbett. He's got shot Booth, I think in the neck is where he got shot. And they dragged Booth out to the nearby farmhouse where I guess the Garrett family lived. And supposedly there's a story where they say that Booth looked at his hands and he said, "Useless, useless." And that was his last words he said. Also, it's kind of interesting. They say that Booth supposedly had this diary on him that they found, that they always talk about, which you may have heard about. And it had a lot of pages that were torn out of it. And so there's been a lot of speculation about what was in the diary and all that, because there are some people who think that there were people involved in the conspiracy. They went all the way to maybe in the government or maybe in the Confederacy. They're not really sure about it, but they think that the conspiracy was bigger than Booth, maybe, that other people were possibly involved, but they don't really know for sure overall. So yeah, the Lincoln assassination is quite changing in the history of Reconstruction later. It's going to totally alter things overall. There's also something that's kind of bizarre that they always talk about, which you may have heard about with the Lincoln assassination. There's a lot of strange similarities between the Lincoln assassination and the Kennedy assassination, which those two are considered the most famous, in American history. Like I said, you can see there's some of them right there. There's a lot of them that's more than that that they think happened. Both were slain the president of their wives. John Wilkes Booth was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939. Both assassins were known by three names. Both were Southerners with unpopular ideas. Each name contained 15 letters. Weird. Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and hid in a warehouse farm. Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and hid in a theater. Booth and Oswald were murdered before a trial could be arranged. Both Lincoln and JFK were succeeded by Southern Democrats. What's really weird is that Lincoln was succeeded by Andrew Johnson and JFK was succeeded by Lyndon Johnson. So that's weird about the different things. Also, both were shot on a Friday, which is true. They used to say that John F. Kennedy, of course, had a secretary named Lincoln, and then of course Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy, but that's not true. That was not true for sure. There is one they always talk about, though, which is famous, I joke about, which is Lincoln was killed in Ford's Theater, and then Kennedy was killed in a Lincoln Continental. Well, the one I like is Lincoln was, before he was killed, was in Maryland, and John F. Kennedy, before he was killed, was with Maryland Monroe. But so yeah, all those like different, similarities are kind of strange about it, So, but we're going to, of course, get more into and talk, of course, about what happens after that. Of course, the big thing that occurs is Andrew Johnson takes over as president of the United States. He, of course, becomes the 17th president, of course, of the United States. Who was Johnson? Johnson, of course, was a Democrat from Tennessee. I think he originally came from North Carolina. I think he was born there. Yeah, moved to Tennessee. I think originally he was a Jacksonian Democrat that had served like as governor of Tennessee. He was also a senator and representative at one point. And when he took control of the White House, of course, he had his own ideas about Reconstruction, which I'll talk about in a second. It's called the 50% plan sometimes is what they call it. But what happened was Andrew Johnson, if you know about it, was one of the very few Southerners that supported the Civil War. In fact, I think he was the only Southern senator that backed the North over the South. And so since he was from Tennessee, and he had been governor of Tennessee, by the way, previously, I think he was governor of Tennessee from 1853 to 57, he was made military governor of Tennessee, which he was from 1862 to 65. And then when Lincoln ran for re-election in 1864, he was concerned about not getting enough votes in the border states. And so that's why he put Johnson in on his ticket as vice president in 1864. So he's kind of like this accidental president that comes into power because Lincoln gets shot. You can see he's president from 1865 to 1869. Now, Johnson, like I said, had his own plans. There's different theories, different nicknames, I guess they call his plan. One of it, the common names that they often call his plan, the so-called 50% plan, because Lincoln had the 10% plan and all that. And Johnson was more supportive of the South, but he didn't like the aristocracy. He didn't like the planter class, and all of that. He had owned slaves, like a few slaves. I don't think that many. So he's kind of seen as this white supremacist, which a lot of people were back then. And but he had different ideas, like he would pardon certain people, that were in the Confederacy, but not the leaders. So not the military leaders, not like Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis. None of those people, of course, could be pardoned. He did say that if half the male voters of a state would take an oath to the Union, that they would allow that state to return as long as they adopt the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. So it's kind of similar to Lincoln's plan, but his was like just all the voters that were, I guess, after the war that they had. So if you had 1 million voters, say in North Carolina, that would mean only half of them would have to take an oath before they would be admitted into the Union. So those are some of the ideas that he had, of course, with Reconstruction. But you're going to see later it's kind of controversial because, a lot of people, of course, aren't going to support it. Later, we will have a bunch of these Civil War amendments that will, of course, be created after the war. Of course, the 13th Amendment was the first one that came out in 1865, which, of course, abolished slavery in the United States because the Emancipation Proclamation only abolished slavery where the Confederacy was, not the other states that, had slavery like Maryland or whatever. Then the 14th Amendment, I'll get to these later, but the 14th Amendment will get like African-American freedmen, they'll get the right to citizenship, just men. And then the 15th Amendment will give basically African-American men the right to vote. Is what it'll do, of course, later. Pretty much anybody the right to vote now, but women didn't get the right to vote until around after World War I. So that's much later, of course, when that happened. Now, let me talk about also what the issues were of Reconstruction before we get deeply into Reconstruction. At the time, the South was a mess, a total mess. It was, in total ruins at the time after the war ended. And the South was like a wilderness of crumbling walls, naked chimneys, and trees killed by flames. As one observer said, pretty much a lot of your major cities, Richmond, Virginia, Columbia, South Carolina, Atlanta, were all burned to the ground. So a lot of the cities were just destroyed or abandoned overall. So homes were burned. A lot of businesses didn't exist. A lot of people abandoned properties and things like that. A lot of African Americans, former slaves, about 3 to 4 million of them were now free. But I guess the question was, free to do what? Because a lot of them, after the Civil War ended, didn't really have any. They couldn't read or write. They didn't own any land. Some of them didn't have skills, no education, no money. So all these kind of things were kind of problems. Lack citizenship. So these were kind of problems that the federal government would have to struggle to figure out and try to reconstruct the South, of course, after the war. Also try to restore the economy of the South, which was, in shambles pretty much. You also had a lot of people that were orphans. A lot of women were widows, things like that, of course, after the war overall. So what happened next was they, of course, if you know about this, they came up with the Freedmen's Bureau, which is one of the first federal organizations that really helped out people like welfare and the underprivileged and the poor in the country. And the actual original name of the Freedmen's Bureau is the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. It's kind of a mouthful, so they call it Freedmen's Bureau for short. It was actually part of the U.S. Department of War. And it was created in March of 1865 to primarily aid African Americans, like former slaves. They called them freedmen back then. But not just that, but help out widows of the war, orphans, etc., deal with what happened after the war. And it also dealt with like abandoned lands. It set up schools to educate people also as well. But a lot of it was, like I said, geared towards aiding a lot of the freedmen, of course, after the war. You can see that one of the founders of it, the Freedmen's Bureau, was a Union general named Oliver O. Howard, which I think O stood for Otis. Oliver Otis Howard. And he was a Union general in the war. In the Civil War, he fought at Gettysburg against Lee's forces. And Howard's not just the founder of the Freedmen's Bureau. He was well known for setting up schools and universities for African Americans, with the most famous one, of course, which is Howard University, which was founded in 1867 in Washington, D.C. So he was known for doing stuff like that. And so they were involved in trying to set up schools, try to, get African Americans to read and write, be literate, and so on. And so that's something that he helped to do, of course, at the beginning after the Civil War ended. But if you know about the Freedmen's Bureau, they were kind of restricted. A lot of the Southerners did not trust, of course, the North or the military, coming into like their states and all that. And so if you know about a lot of the Southern states, tried to control a lot of the freedmen, like especially the labor aspect after the war, because there was no more slavery anymore at that point. And so a lot of the states started creating what they call black codes, which were kind of based off the old antebellum slave codes that had been created, prior to the Civil War actually occurring. And black codes, of course, they're actually called the Negro codes, because back then they didn't use that term black until later, but the word Negro just means black in Spanish. But the codes were created primarily to control, like I said, labor. And the laws were really strict. If you read about the black codes, I'll kind of go through and talk about. So, of course, it says something on there on the screen. You could not own property or guns. That's true about that. No voting right. They couldn't have any right to vote overall. If no job, they could be arrested and forced to work for no pay. That's also as well. They had some things in the codes they could do, like they could. If you see here, they were permitted to own. Well, they couldn't own personal property, I believe, but they could sue in court. I think was one thing they could do. They could marry, I know, under the codes and things like that. But a lot of their basic civil rights were kind of like banned or controlled overall. Mississippi had the worst one of the black codes. They pretty much, it was almost like kind of like the old slave code, except they took they got rid of the word slave and they put the word Negro or black instead, pretty much. Yeah, in Mississippi, some black Southerners were forbidden to possess firearms, forbidden to assemble unless white Southerners were present. They could not appear on the street after dark, like a sundown town, if you know what that is. They had to travel. If they traveled somewhere, they had to have permits. If they went from place to place, more or less. But a lot of it was to, like I said, control labor and so on, why they did it the most. They had these codes from like 1865 to about 1866, but they were banned by the government and the military. And this angered the Republicans that were in Congress. And so a lot of the Congress blocked Democrats from holding office because of the codes. So that's interesting about that, about what happened. Now, what happened next, of course, was that you then had, we kind of already talked about that. I'm going to get to the Reconstruction Act of 1867. That's, of course, the next thing that's going to happen, of course, with Reconstruction that occurs. If you know about, they had 1866, okay? They had like the midterm elections. And apparently what happened was the Republicans gained control of both houses of Congress. So what that basically did was it allowed Johnson, basically the Congress to override Johnson's vetoes. And so through that, Congress started this whole Congressional Reconstruction. We started in 1867, and they began passing basically bills over Johnson's vetoes. I think Johnson, if you read about it, is one of the most prolific presidents that vetoed the most bills. I believe it was like something like 23 bills, I think, at one point that he vetoed or more. And I think 15 were overridden by Congress. So all these different provisions that were put in it became part of a huge act that they kind of combined together as the Reconstruction Act, or Acts of 1867, which you can see are divided into 5 different things. The first one was, what they did was they put all the 10 states that had not agreed to the, I think it's the 14th Amendment, which was, African American citizenship. They were put in military districts. Tennessee had been the only one that had agreed to the 14th Amendment, and so they were left out. So yeah, all the different ones that were put in it: Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, not Tennessee, it was excluded, South and North Carolina, Virginia. So yeah, not Tennessee, but those are the ones that were basically put in it. Here's a map showing you the different districts that they were put in. So Texas, Louisiana was together, Arkansas, Mississippi together, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and then you got North Carolina, South Carolina, and then Virginia had its own separate district also as well that they were put into. You can see there. You can see some other stuff that was also in there as well. It deprived ex-Confederates of their political rights. So a lot of Confederates, if they had fought for the Confederacy, they couldn't vote or hold office. It gave freedmen political rights, like the right to vote, hold office. It forced states to draft constitutions in favor of freedmen's suffrage, et cetera, to vote as well. And then all the states had to basically ratify the 14th Amendment. So with that, then they could come back in as states. And I think by the 1870s, pretty much most of the states will eventually re-enter the Union over time, is what will eventually happen. Now, the only problem was, of course, was that, Andrew Johnson was not, sympathetic. Of course, they'll ratify the 15th Amendment later, not now, but later. But Andrew Johnson, like I said, was sympathetic toward the South. This was, of course, a big problem, of course, with Reconstruction, with Congress, with the Republicans there who didn't like Andrew Johnson. And so what ended up happening, if you know about it, in 1868, Andrew Johnson was impeached. He was the first president of the United States to ever be impeached. Why was he impeached? Well, he was impeached because of this certain kind of act I'll mention about, which came out prior to this, which was called the Tenure of Office Act, which had been passed by Congress because they were worried that Andrew Johnson was going to fire people that were sympathetic towards military reconstruction. And so with this particular act, what it said was that a president could not dismiss important civil officers without the Senate's consent. It was declared, by the way, unconstitutional later, the 1920s, you can see. And so he fired the Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, who was, of course, involved with the whole Reconstruction of the South, the military Reconstruction. He was like the head of it. And he was also an ally of the radical Republicans. So this really angered a lot of Republicans, of course, in Congress. And so, to control Reconstruction, that's why he was impeached, because they wanted to try to remove him from office. And so from February to May of 1868, I think over like 2.5 months or so, they went through impeachment with eventually a trial. And Andrew Johnson is one of 3 presidents that have been impeached. Of course, Bill Clinton in the 1990s, and then Donald Trump. Of course, the second time. Now they're trying to impeach him now. But impeachment is really a political thing. It's really a lot of politics involved in impeachment. It's usually very partisan also as well. Usually one party over the other tries to impeach the other opposing president. Is what's happening now. But Trump's not president anymore, which is kind of, to me, unconstitutional. But anyway, so what happens, like the trial itself was in May of 1868. And so, the U.S. Senate held the impeachment trial, which, of course, was presided by the Chief Justice at the time, who was Samuel P. Chase. And believe it or not, it fell short by 1 vote. 54 senators voted, of course, for the impeachment. If he had gotten 36 votes there, he would have been found, guilty of it and removed from office. But they failed to basically remove him. So they believed that the impeachment of Andrew Johnson weakened his presidency. It obviously prevented him from running for re-election. I think that's why they're trying to impeach Trump now, because they think he might run for re-election in 2024. I think that's the reason for it, probably, why they're doing that. So they're kind of worried that, Johnson's going to run for re-election in 1868. And so this kind of leads into the presidential election of 1868. What happens, of course, with the presidential election of 1868, the Republicans realized that they're kind of in trouble at this point because of what happened with Andrew Johnson. And so they decide to basically elect somebody who's kind of popular. And so if you know what happened, they nominated General Ulysses S. Grant. You know, was a war hero. He pretty much helped the North defeat the South in the Civil War. And so they chose him. He was really a general and not really a politician. But he was, like I said, very popular because he was a war hero. And Grant basically campaigned on this political tactic they sometimes call waving the bloody shirt, where basically he said, hey, if you fought on the Union side in the war, basically against the Confederates, vote for me. And so they later called that, I think the term they used for that was, they call it vote as you shot. So depending on what side you were on in the war, that became one of the main slogans that they would use, of course, vote as you shot. However, his real slogan was not that. It was actually, let us have peace, is what it was. And they do think in this election that African Americans played a major role in why General Grant won the presidency in 1868. He got about around 500,000 African Americans actually voted for Grant over Horatio Seymour, who was a wealthy governor of New York, who ran against him. And so he actually won a very close election. He only won by 300,000 votes. I think the electoral votes weren't close, but it was kind of close in the actual popular vote overall. Grant would actually go on to serve 2 terms as president. However, Grant, I'll get to it later, not today, but Grant was a very corrupt president. At least the presidency was very corrupt. One of the most corrupt in American history. A lot of bad things happened under his time in power, but it was the beginning of the Gilded Age, which would start like in the 1870s, the late 19th century, when the United States would start industrializing, expanding westward, becoming more like an imperial power, which they will later as well. And that all started under Grant at that time. And he would actually defeat in 1872 also Horace Greeley as well for his second term as well. And by that time, they already kind of knew, that his administration was kind of corrupt. So they kind of knew about that. But I won't talk about that today. I'll kind of move on, and I'll kind of talk about a few other things today before I go also as well, because I got a few other things I want to talk about as well, about Reconstruction in the South, what actually happened. I've got a few minutes. I can kind of go into that a little bit as well. So Reconstruction in the South overall. Reconstruction, I don't know if you know much about it, but it was heavily dominated by the Republican allies, which these are the 3 that were mostly involved in Reconstruction and controlling a lot of the power in the southern states: carpetbaggers, scalawags, and what they call freedmen, which of course were African Americans. They say about 2/3 of the South was controlled by carpetbaggers. These are people that came from the North. They were white Republicans, and they took advantage of the South and were viewed, by the way, many as like scoundrels, is basically kind of what they were seen as to a lot of people, more or less. And they were called carpetbaggers, by the way, because they came to the South with these suitcases that were made out of carpet. Like the outside, it looked like a carpet or made like carpet, basically, and hence the name. And like I said, about 2/3 of the people that controlled the South were predominantly carpetbaggers. Like examples, in 1868, 4 governors, 10 U.S. senators, 20 U.S. representatives in the South were all carpetbaggers. The rest were either African American or scalawags that controlled also the South as well. And of course, the view of them, like I said, were scoundrels, these people that took advantage of people, and they actually did. They took advantage of a lot of people. Like, if you know about this, a lot of carpetbaggers took advantage of African Americans, in the South. They took like money from them. I think Horace Greeley said it best that such carpetbaggers were stealing and plundering, many of them with both arms around the blacks and their hands in their rear pockets, seeing if they cannot pick a paltry dollar out of them. So they took advantage of people, stole people's land and things like that. And so they were kind of unscrupulous, the carpetbaggers. But there were some that did good things too, that helped out people, African Americans in general. But that's kind of the view a lot of people kind of have of them later. Scalawags were Southern-born white Republicans. So these were people that were in the South that had not supported. They didn't support the Civil War and the Confederacy. So they were against. They had actually supported the Union side in the war, and they were seen, by the way, as traitors by white Southerners. And a lot of them had a lot of power too after the war. And many of them, like I said, were Republicans, of course, that were involved in the war. Also, African Americans, like I said, had a lot of power too during Reconstruction. I think I've got that number there. I think over 600 may have been politicians in the South. I might be exaggerating the number, but at least 16 were U.S. congressmen at one point after the Civil War during Reconstruction. Those are the most famous. From Mississippi, they actually had at one point 2 senators were both African American, Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce, which is interesting about that was there. So both those were actually politicians at one point. Also in Louisiana, you may have heard of PBS Pinchback. He, of course, was at one point lieutenant governor, and apparently when the governor, I think, of Louisiana had been impeached, he became governor for a few years. Henry Warmoth, I think it was, who got impeached, he took over, and so he was actually governor of Louisiana, the only African-American governor of Louisiana, which I think was in the 1870s, I believe is when it was, when he held power. So that's something interesting, that occurred at that time, where they had all this power, but it was obviously fleeting. It would be eventually taken away, a lot of their power, when the white Democrats would take back power, of course, in the South at the end of Reconstruction and all that. Also, I did want to talk about, you've probably heard of course, the famous, I'll get to that, of course, throw a slide right there, but the famous Ku Klux Klan, as you know, was also involved in the South as well. They, of course, fought to try to gain power back for, of course, white Democrats, of course, after the Civil War ended. And the Ku Klux Klan was a white supremacy group, of course, that was founded in 1867 by Nathan Bedford Forrest, who, of course, was an ex-Confederate cavalry general, who later was its first Grand Wizard. I think they founded this house called the Maxwell House in Pulaski, Tennessee. He kind of regretted it later, though, being Grand Wizard. He didn't really know what they were trying to do, I think, at that point. But basically, a lot of these were Southern whites that were angry, the fact that they didn't really have any political rights at all. And so a lot of them formed these clans, like different groups that were out there. It wasn't just the Ku Klux Klan. There was a bunch of them. You may have heard of the Knights of the White Camellia, which I think were popular in Louisiana. The White Brotherhood was another one that was popular. The Pale Faces. There was different groups that had different names that were kind of around at the time. And a lot of them would use terror tactics to go after African Americans, anybody that was a Republican in the South. And so they would use like lynchings and beatings, cross burnings, and burn churches and other buildings down, people's homes, they would burn them down, and things like that. And so they use that kind of things to basically intimidation, I guess, to really try to gain power back, more or less. There were different forms of the Klan, over time. That's kind of how they dress. They actually would dress up like ghosts because they were kind of believed to be acting like they were the dead ghosts of, or the ghosts of dead Civil War Confederates. And that's the reason for why they dressed up, with hoods on and all that, but also to cover up their identity of who they are. Here's some pictures right there of the Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan, was around for many years. It's still around today, but it's, not very popular anymore like it used to be. The later Klans, there's like 3 different versions of the Klan over time. It peaked in the 1920s, the second version of it, which was more of a kind of a pro-nativist type organization that hated Jews, Catholics, and other immigrants that were coming to the country in the late 19th and early 20th century. And they peaked in 1925 with you can see 5 million members that were part of it. And then when the civil rights movement came in, like in the 1950s and 60s, it came back again and kind of became popular. But very few people are in it today, more or less. The Klan was later broken up because of the Force Acts that kind of came out, or also called Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 71. These were passed by Congress, and Grant used like the military to break up the Klan and protect the rights of African Americans in the South and all that. They think over time, though, that part of why the Klan disappeared was because of the Amnesty Act of 1872 that came out. This basically eventually pardoned all the ex-Confederates, except some of the few that were like in the top government and military, like Robert E. Lee wasn't pardoned until later, I think after he was dead. But basically, it would give them their political rights back, the right to vote, the right to hold office. And so what's going to happen over time because of this, the Democrats are going to re-seize power, of course, in the South. They call themselves later the Redeemers. And so that's going to eventually lead into the end of Reconstruction. That'll happen later because the end of Reconstruction will become by the late 1870s. You'll see when they have the 1876 presidential election, that's one of the main events that eventually leads into the end of Reconstruction, which will basically not be completed like it should, because it should have been completed where African Americans had more rights, but they're not. So I'm probably going to stop here for today because I don't think I'm going to be able to finish all of Reconstruction today. But next time I'm going to I'm going to finish up Reconstruction, and I'm going to talk about the rise of the New South. That's one of the things I'll talk about first. I'll talk about segregation. It's something that kind of comes out. Jim Crow is something that's going to come out, that'll basically occur like segregation. And I'll talk about that as well. And then I will be getting into the beginning of the Gilded Age. So we'll get into that and talk about 1870s and afterwards in American history. So pretty much this coming next week and probably week 2 and 3, we'll be getting into talking about the late 19th century the most overall. So before I go, I want to remind you a few things, of course, about some things you need to complete in week 1. Of course, I told you the pre-test needs to be finished. Don't forget to get that done. It's in quizzes, so get that done. Student contract policy page needs to be uploaded, of course, to the speed grader in assignments. So go to that assignment there and get that done. Try to get those done by 12 noon on Friday, because if nobody has not done that yet, you are going to be removed from the class for no attendance, because the attendance, like I said, is going to be counted by assignments. And of course, my main assignment for week 1 is the pre-test. I guess I'll count the contract policy page too as well, if you've done that also as well. So like I said, send me any comments, questions about this lecture. Of course, maybe next time you can watch me in the live stream, some of you, because you do get bonus points for watching me, of course, lecture live. But if not, you can send me comments and questions, which you get bonus points for that. So that's it for this week. Don't forget Mardi Gras coming up next week, Monday and Tuesday, no classes. So don't forget that. No lecture that day until probably next Thursday. I'll let you know in a future announcement, of course, my next lecture coming up. And I'll send you this lecture, of course, via email. So y'all take care, and I'll see you next Thursday.